then it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker in our session on Rethinking Historical Trauma in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Ronald Niezen, who's a professor in the Faculty of Law, and as well as having been the chair of anthropology here, and who has been involved for many years in Indigenous health and governance and issues, both in terms of politics and in terms of legal issues, and most fundamentally from our point of view in terms of expressions of personhood and identity and how those are negotiated in various public and private spaces. So it's a pleasure then to introduce Ron.
For the invitation and for being invited in particular to start off the substantive part of this meeting. It is rather a striking book cover. I can see why people like it. And it's nice as an author to have that as the end result. We say that it shouldn't really matter, but it does. I want to talk here a bit about some of the emotions and consequences of testimony to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools that completes its work next year. The book that I wrote was in a way unfair to the commission itself because it came out while it was in the middle of the work. But I did that on the understanding with the University of Toronto Press that I would complete a second edition of the book not long after the work of the commission is over. So in a way, it's an experiment in publishing that I'm talking about, or that's the basis of my work, and an ongoing project. So even though it's between covers, I continue to do research and think about this issue. One of the starting points and ideas that finds its way into the title of the book is the idea of indignation as the foundation of many people's thinking as they come to give testimony. They're indignant about something. They're indignant about their past. The emotion comes out sometimes in very striking ways. So when we go sort of beyond thinking about the trauma part of what is coming out in testimony, a good part of it is indignation, which is, I see as being an equivalent of the sense of injustice, which can be a very deep emotion, as I found from a novel from the 1920s by Jakob Wasserman, not a particularly great novel, but here he's writing about a young man and his discovery of a sense of injustice and describes it in very powerful emotional terms as leading to a kind of a suffocation. And indeed, this is part of what we see as people talk about their experience, and as I'll mention, as they go beyond their experience, and talk about things that they're indignant about today, things that they're living that they feel indignant about, not just things from the past. So some essential facts about Indian residential schools. The last of the schools closed in the mid-1990s. There were some 140 schools throughout their operation. The number of students total in the period over a century in which they were operational is 150,000, 86,000 of whom are alive today. This has resulted in the largest restitutive agreement in Canadian history, which is now moving into the billions of dollars, with compensation going for those who can demonstrate prove that they were a student in the school, and they get a compensation amount for every year that they were in school, but then a complicated regime of restitution, financial settlement that follows the design of torts, of lawsuits, that attaches a dollar amount to different kinds of trauma, which much of the focus being on sexual abuse and various forms of sexual abuse and physical abuse that people experienced in the schools. So before people are going to give testimony to the commission, many of them have already given testimony in some of these meetings that are aimed at determining a restitution amount. through the independent assessment process that is run by the federal government. Many people see that the process of writing these things down has been for them a traumatic experience. So what we have in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not traditional transitional justice in the sense of a change of regime, as you would say in Guatemala or South Africa, but an outcome of a growing number of lawsuits in the early 2000s that just had to be settled. They were bankrupting the churches. So it's an outcome of litigation, which means that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not resulting from warfare or something that everybody was aware of, sees its work as being to publicize the historical events that are at the root of its work. It sees its objective as making the history of residential schools known, which is a very unusual thing for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to do, to make the national shame, the trauma, the human rights abuses known to a wider public. It's almost exclusively focused on harms to children, where we know about civil wars in Africa, but here it is almost overwhelmingly childhood experience that people bring to the podium. It's significantly concerned with trauma and mental illness. So when people come to talk about their experience, they're often talking about and using lay language about trauma and traumatic experience and how they feel that and how it affects them to this day. Another thing that's important that has to do with the legal background, but that affects the way that people give testimony, is that the mandate is very weak. The TRC is not able to compel people. It doesn't have any juridical authority. It does not have subpoena power. It cannot bring people to give testimony. It cannot do a lot of things other than invite people to give testimony and to provide conditions of affirmation around that process. This is very different from other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and it places particular emphasis on the testimony of those who are known as, and know themselves as, Indian residential school survivors. And what happens through the process of giving testimony is a kind of a selectivity, a kind of a preferential focus on particular kinds of testimony, not just in this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but in many, many others, including that of South Africa. And this many people find notable when they give their testimony, that their experience doesn't entirely fit within a model of what Richard Wilson refers to as information management. In South Africa, Wilson finds many people were indignant about this, using the word indignation again, but I find that in Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this process of information management, or creating conditions of moral approval for particular kinds and insecurity for particular kinds of testimony, was not really noted by people who participated. There is a focus on the trauma aspect of school experience symbolically, and also of cultural survival and reinvigoration as a part of the Commission's work. And here we have a photograph that captures two of these. One is the bentwood box that is front and center in all of the national events of the Commission. Another, a drum that was put there after the opening ceremonies of the national event in Saskatoon. These are also highly public events, as evidenced by this scrum of photographers at the opening ceremonies in Winnipeg in 2010, I think that was. And here they're focusing on a drum. So there's an emphasis on the poignant aspects of both Aboriginal culture and of the testimony itself. here we have an image from the third day of the commissioners' sharing panel in Nunavik. And I want to draw your attention to the very public nature of this event. Even though the size of the audience at this point has dwindled, we have this huge screen that displays the person who is giving testimony. Not only this one, but there was another in the room and two more with a performance quality sound system outside of the building. So people are very much on display when they give testimony, and the focus is on, I think the focus is on the traumatic nature of the testimony that they're giving when the cameras are there. And I know this because of seeing one woman who couldn't control the shaking of her hands as she was giving testimony. And I narrate this in the book. And she went to hide them under the table. And one of the photographers panned into and focused in on her hands as they were trembling, and she was holding them in her lap, wanting to conceal them. So there is an emphasis on those kinds of emotions as the TRC does its work. And a recognition that giving testimony is traumatic, so that when people go to give testimony, they're there with somebody who is their support person, as they're called. You don't stand up there or sit at the table in front of the microphone alone. It is seen as being traumatizing, as I'll get to in a moment. So they're highly motivated to talk about their experience when they come to the commissioners' sharing panel. I was not witness to any of the private sessions other than my own, but this is another way that people give testimony. People who give testimony to the public venues are there, as they put it, to make their voices heard, to make things known, to make their experience understood. And they want to shape history. But my argument is, as I'll get to, is that they're shaping history and describing trauma and emotion in a particular way. It's important to recognize that this testimony that people are giving is very emotionally evocative and powerful. And that is the kind of testimony that, in fact, is preferred by the commission. There are people in the churches who give apologies. There are very rare and formal appearances by government representatives, but the overwhelming bulk of the testimony of the presentations to the commission consist of very powerful, evocative memories of the worst kind of trauma that you could imagine, relating usually preponderantly to experiences of sexual abuse, although it isn't limited to that. So the audiences are moved. They're moved to anger and indignation, as you can see in the faces that we have, that I've captured in Iqaluit, in Winnipeg, in Inuvik. And the audience in the commissioners' sharing panel in Saskatoon. Here is more evidence of what I'm talking about, with a volunteer going around gathering Kleenexes from people who've shed tears, with Kleenex boxes placed on every third seat. And you can see that the bag is fairly full. And when people give their testimony, it is in a way memorialized, captured for them to bring home. So if they choose, they can take a DVD of this narration of their trauma, something that basically is a highly unusual experience for many of them who come from remote places. In Inuvik, there is one Inuit man who said that this was the furthest south he'd ever been. And so a highly unusual experience that is then captured and memorialized on a take-home DVD. And I have asked myself what the effects of that might be in terms of making that an essential part of a person's identity and making the residential school experience and the worst aspect of it that are brought out in the testimony a sort of a permanent aspect of a very important life experience for many of these people. There is a focus on the history of the schools as being genocidal. And this is something that is part of the Commission's work in publicizing the history of residential schools. So it's inviting speakers to talk about genocide and cultural genocide and inviting discussions from the floor about that aspect of the history of the schools. And it does provoke people to think, but also provokes, I think, a rethinking, a reshaping of the sort of normal conceptions, the usual public conceptions of Canadian history and the history of the schools. So this is a part of what the Commission is doing through the trauma to make an argument about the genocidal nature of Indian residential schools, and more broadly to make not just a contribution to reconciliation and healing, but to rethink Canadian history, to have new information that provokes or provides the foundation for rethinking the history of the state, the narrative of the state. And, of course, trauma is a part of that background. And it is seen, like other TRCs, as Martha Minow tells us, it is seen as being healing, that giving testimony and creating this new narrative of the state is something that heals individuals, families, communities, and ultimately the nation. That is what the TRC sees itself as doing. And yet, when you look a little bit more closely, it is also dealing with emotions that are recognized broadly as being dangerous for individuals. Here is the pop-up screen that I excerpted from the Indian Residential Schools Secretariat, subsequently taken down as the Secretariat wound down its work. But it is seen as being related to triggering, sudden onset of traumatic memory that debilitates a person, hopefully temporarily, that requires them to go to a quiet place, to seek intervention, to have smudging and support people to talk them down from it, to calm them, and to bring them back to a state of normalcy. This doesn't only happen to Aboriginal participants. I remember a Presbyterian minister who actually talked to one of my researchers, talking about a very similar experience when he talked about his background as a young man in the school and didn't think much of his testimony. But when he came down from the podium, he found himself, as he put it, wandering through rooms in a daze, his heart palpitating. He needed to take a few hours, talk to his wife on the phone, go to the healing center, actually get some help in order to have himself come back from that experience that followed from giving testimony. So this is something that is recognized as part of the experience of giving testimony. And triggering is sort of a very commonly understood phenomenon. And it isn't just giving testimony, it's being at the site. It's the photographs that are seen as creating this kind of reaction. One person had it in response to a person walking by with a clipboard, and it reminded them of an abusive nun that used to carry a similar clipboard. So anything is seen as, ordinary things are seen in this context of the TRC meeting as creating this sort of triggering effect. And it's of course, recognized in the literature as something that can follow from reliving traumatic events. So in Richard McNally's work on remembering trauma, traumatic events can result in this kind of vividness and emotionally intense, not just reconstruction of the past, but emotional response to the past that makes it seem present and real. But all of this is happening in the context of, I think, a lack of awareness, full awareness about what the mental health consequences of giving testimony are long term. It's coming in the context of the dismantling of the Aboriginal healing foundations, so that even where resources in remote Aboriginal communities, those communities that are particularly affected by this kind of thing, even where resources are there, they're undergoing transition and disruption. So the timing couldn't be worse. And many people are talking about the experience of the TRC as not just healing, but also re-traumatizing. There is more than one voice about the healing effects of the commission. And I think that try as it might, and it is trying to address the mental health concerns in many ways. But through the lack of resources and through the lack of full engagement, I think, with the real consequences of giving testimony, it hasn't been able to deal effectively with the sort of aftermath of and immediate effects of the commission as it has done its work. So we have this kind of description of the commission's effects in Inuvik, which describe the lack of services and the fact that people who were seeking help couldn't find it. Finally, as I wind down, there are voices that are absent from the Truth Commission, so that the full scope of trauma and the full scope of historical memorization of this experience and of the rethinking of the narrative of the state is not being heard to the full extent that it can through the kind of preferred testimony that the TRC has, and a kind of moral exclusion that the priests, nuns, and brothers reported to me in their way of thinking about the commission. So because of the background in lawsuits, because of the identification, the broad identification of the people who ran the schools as perpetrators, many of them feel completely disaffected by the work of the commission. And this shows itself in a way, in the photographs that are selected for display at the commission events. This is not an atypical display in which the church people who wanted to represent their experience of the schools chose very positive memories and experiences. Girls baking bread, a boy shooting a bow and arrow, coming home with fish, and above all, hockey. So they want the positive experiences of the schools to also become part of the history of the church and the narrative of the state. So there is this exclusion of particular kinds of testimony, a preference for testimony that supports arguments about the traumatic and traumatizing nature of the schools, which is there, but it isn't the full spectrum of school experience. My concern is that through the exclusion of some kinds of experience, through people feeling that they can't give testimony, through state officials, for example, being unwilling to give testimony and the commission not having the power to bring them to the podium, there is a particular approach that's being taken to the history of the schools that doesn't reflect their reality, that makes it impossible to see contemporary new forms of trauma, institutional abuse. This we see when people give testimony and they go off the topic, and I'll conclude with this. There's a phenomenon that I refer to as while I have the microphone, and that is when people give their testimony about the schools and about the trauma that happened to them there. Very often what they do is they say something like, and while I have the microphone, let me tell you this. What's really bothering me? And in terms of indignation, this is why they're there. And very often it's about the government's adoption policies that are removing children, or it's about poverty in the residential, in the reserve system. It's about racism on the job. It's about things that are rankling people now, today. And my sense is that when people are giving testimony and looking at the past, a lot of what's influencing them, a lot of what's re-traumatizing them, if you want to call it that, are the contemporary issues, problems, unaddressed, a contemporary sense of indignation from politics, from policies that are happening now. Let's end on that note.